Hey everybody, this is Eric Jacobson. Today, Joseph, Ricci, and I are going to be talking to you about some of our favorite Civil War books and also Civil War books that we find interesting or were impactful over the last few decades. So we're going to mention what they are, give a little blurb, what our thoughts are, why we think they're important. So I thought I would start with two that really impacted me. One written many, many years ago and one more recently, but they're really important books, I think, that kind of set the stage for Civil War. So the first one is a book written by a fellow named John Blassingame, who worked at LSU, taught, I believe, at LSU for many years. It's called The Slave Community. Blassingame wrote this book in the early 70s, and it was so far ahead of its time because it's a book that really focuses on the people, not just the institution. And he provided a lot of information that I found groundbreaking. I know one of the things that I never forgot about this book was there's this common perception that, of course, field slaves would have had the worst of experiences. And I think Blassingame points out with great effectiveness, it was often slaves who worked in the homes, like Carter House, where we are, or Carnton, Ripavilla, other sites that we manage. The enslaved people who worked in the homes actually had experiences far worse than those who worked outside, because those who worked in the homes were subject to the master's whims 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They never got out from beneath the master's eye, the master's hand, or the master's mouth. So this is a great one, The Slave Community by John W. Blassingame.
I think maybe the first book I should mention is probably the very first book about the Civil War that I read. And it is the American Heritage Golden Book of the Civil War. And I think what captured my attention when I was maybe 6 or 7 was the maps. Of course, this is a map of Franklin. It has to be, naturally. And maybe this is the first time that I got to see what that battle looked like. And now, granted, interpretation has changed. Maps have gotten a lot better. It's what sparked my interest. And I think that reading this and seeing it at such a young age is what has led me to where I'm at now with what seems like an obsession with Civil War books. This next series of books is maybe a little problematic for some, but I would say that they still deserve to have a place in a favorite Civil War book list because they did popularize the American Civil War. Shelby Foote had written these over a period of about 30 years, so you've got volume 1 through 3 of his narrative of the Civil War. Now, it's not an academic history. It's not something that you could argue a point over and cite and say that Shelby Foote said it in his book. But if you wanted a general overview of the entire American Civil War and you wanted to read it in, say, 4 months, this is the way to do it because it is 3 volumes of everything you would ever want to know. There are some problems with it, and that's okay. It is a book that will introduce you to the American Civil War, just like it introduced me and countless of thousands of other scholars on the American Civil War. Everybody at some point has come in contact with Shelby Foote's Civil War narrative.
The second one that I want to mention is a book called Lincoln and the Politics of Slavery by Daniel Crofts. This is a must-read. This book effectively points out, I think like no other, that Abraham Lincoln always detested and hated slavery. It shows how he spoke about the institution and really the evils of it, the moral ambiguities about it, that it was in conflict with the Declaration of Independence. But Lincoln, as a lawyer, understood that slavery was a state-based institution, and he didn't feel that slavery could end or that he would have any real say in ending the practice. So he took the approach that slavery had to be controlled, and so he takes the stand on anti-expansion. He doesn't want slavery moving out beyond where it already existed. The book also, I think, very effectively shows how Lincoln was trying, with many in his administration, to keep the upper states of the South, like Tennessee, in the Union, feeling that if they could keep Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, North Carolina in the Union, they would have a much better handle on trying to control the 7 states that did secede. But in the end, of course, they do secede, and then Lincoln eventually uses the power of the executive office in the war to once and for all attack and end slavery. But it's a great book that shows the complexities of Lincoln as a person, Lincoln as a politician, but really Lincoln as the President of the United States.
James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom. This is by far the staple Civil War book. This is the one that everyone has to read because it is, by and large, the best general history of the American Civil War. Nothing has surpassed it since, and McPherson lays out not only a great argument, but he also lays out the entire history of the American Civil War, beginning through the actual war itself, all the way through to Reconstruction, and talks about just about everything that you could imagine you'd want. If you want battle narratives, there's battle narratives. If you want brief biographies, there's brief biographies. He manages to take something that is so large and on such a macro scale and bring it down to a private in the ranks, and that is something that is a real gift.
A must-read, Jefferson Davis, The Man in His Hour, a biography by William C. Davis. I've had the fortune of meeting him. Everybody who knows him is Jack Davis. This is one of a couple books about Davis. Another one I considered bringing in, written by William Cooper. But this book really shows what a powerhouse Jefferson Davis was, both as senator, as a Secretary of War, Mississippi senator, just as the war is about to unfold. But the main thrust of this is the man in his hour as he becomes chosen to be president of the fledgling Confederate States of America. If you want to know anything about Jefferson Davis, really between 1861 and 1865, this is the book.
The next book is another favorite of mine by one of my favorite Civil War authors, maybe one of my favorite historians of American history, is Allen Guelzo. Guelzo's Fateful Lightning is very similar to McPherson in that it is a general history of the war. It's a little bit shorter in terms of length than his book, but it also incorporates what he calls a new history of the Civil War and a new history of Reconstruction, building on arguments that have come throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. Guelzo is able to put together about 400 pages or so of updated information that maybe McPherson didn't have access to or wasn't as easy to access in the age that McPherson wrote Battle Cry of Freedom, as opposed to when Guelzo releases this new, more updated version. For those looking for a general history of the war, either one of these two, Battle Cry of Freedom or Fateful Lightning, is an incredible choice.
Robert E. Lee. Everybody knows Robert Edward Lee. When Emory Thomas wrote this book and it was published around 1990, I got it and I was stunned. Emory Thomas was really the first writer that I was aware of who took Lee to task and began to chip away at this idea of what Thomas Connolly once referred to as the Marble Man. He criticized some of Lee's decisions as a military commander, and I really think in some ways, what Thomas did, and by the way, Emory Thomas is a Southerner, he put flesh back on the bone. He showed Lee as a human being, I think, in ways that previous authors never had. And this, just 30 years ago, really began to reshape how people view Robert E. Lee.
If you've read Shelby Foote and you've read The Golden Book and you've read the other introductory books, you don't really come in contact with the real toll of the American Civil War. And that is the point of this book. It's Drew Gilpin Faust, This Republic of Suffering. And she looks at death in the American Civil War. This is a war that cost the lives of more than 600,000, close to 750,000 men. And this book talks about it all. And it brings that point of the war, the reality of the war, the grim, gruesome details of war straight to you, because this is an American population in 1861 through 65 that has never seen loss on such a scale as this. Faust goes into incredible detail. Not only that, she is just a wonderful scholar. She was, of course, the first female president at Harvard. And so what she has here is just an incredible work, not only of just academic scholarship, but something that I think anyone with a Civil War interest should read. Too often the war is sort of reduced to guts and glory and gallantry and heroism, but that also overlooks the fact that these aren't just lines on a map. They're not just individuals that are focused on the war. They're human beings that leave behind wives and families and mothers and husbands and fathers. So this is the book to read when encountering the reality of war.
This book is, for anyone interested in the war in the Western theater, again, a must-read. Shiloh and the Western Campaign of 1862. It was written by Edward Cunningham, but Cunningham died very young, and his manuscript was unpublished for many years. Gary Joyner and Tim Smith took up the task of resurrecting Cunningham's manuscript, and they did us all a great service. This book changed my thought process about Shiloh. I'll never forget hearing about this manuscript before it was published from people who were very familiar with Shiloh and had known Cunningham. And I love this because one of the jobs, I think, of good writers, scholars, historians is sometimes to break apart old myths. And Cunningham just completely dismantles the sunken road, hornet's nest story that had been told at Shiloh for decades and decades. You got to read it if you're interested in the Battle of Shiloh. Then there is this behemoth, which is, it's about 900 pages. It's like the size of the Bible. Edited by Brooke Simpson and Jean Berlin. This is Sherman's Civil War. Selected correspondence of William T. Sherman from 1860 to 1865. If you want to know anything, you got to read this book, because this is what Sherman was writing to everybody under the sun, particularly his wife, his brother, but officers that he served with throughout the war. You get the true, not that Sherman was ever very good at covering up his emotions or what he thought. He was pretty straightforward, but you get the completely unvarnished thought process of whether you like him, whether you love him, whether you hate him, or whether you're ambivalent. This guy is one of the 2 or 3 most important people of the Civil War. So if you can get it, get it.
So the next book is Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals. And this is a political history of the Lincoln administration. Goodwin, of course, is a fantastic presidential biographer, and she takes Lincoln to task here in this book. And what she does is she reveals really the political genius and the nature of his cabinet. The title sort of gives it away, but Lincoln brings together political opponents and rivals of his own to make this administration that not only is going to fight the American Civil War, and is not only going to win the American Civil War, but they will also pass the 13th Amendment and begin a period of reconstruction that will bring this nation back together. And Doris Kearns Goodwin is able to approach that in such a human way. You tap into the mind of a guy like Edwin Stanton, who of course was no great fan of Abraham Lincoln to begin with, but by the end is right there at the bedside as Lincoln passes away and says, now he belongs to the ages. So this book is incredible. A must read. The second to last book, one of these biographies that I chose, is a look at a man that is pretty specific to our sites here at Carter House, Carnton, and Rippavilla, all the BOFT sites, is Confederate General John Bell Hood. And while this is not the newest, most up-to-date biography on him, Richard McMurray wrote, I think, one of the groundbreaking biographies for the 1980s on Hood, because he looked back at the historiography, he examined what had been written about Hood, and decided that not all of it could have been true. The ideas about laudanum, the ideas about being dumb, all these things, McMurray sort of takes to task here. And not only that, he's writing this book in an era before there's new evidence found out about John Bell Hood. And so when a historian is able to look at things that didn't quite look right, couldn't add up, he manages to still be able to write this book. And this is really the book for me that sort of starts it all for Franklin. Is I read about John Bell Hood, then I read Advance and Retreat, then I read Jacob D. Cox's narrative, and all of a sudden I started to develop this fascination with this battle, this fascination with the campaign, and of course, this fascination with the man.
I got this book years ago. It's the Memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. For some reason, I never got around to buying an original edition, which were published in the 1880s. I got this reprint about 100 years later, but nonetheless, the best memoir written by any participant of the American Civil War. Hands down, even people at the time, both Federal and Confederate, believed these were the most honest, straightforward, balanced memoirs. And it was just typical of who Grant was. So if you want to really know what happened, not just from Grant's perspective, but what really happened militarily, what was happening in the Western Theater, and what happens in the Eastern Theater at the end of the war through the eyes of the man who had a front row seat to some of the greatest conflicts of the American Civil War, from Shiloh all the way to the fall of Petersburg and the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. You got to read Grant's memoirs. And I saved, I think, probably the best for last. Douglas Southall Freeman. Douglas Southall Freeman was a great admirer of Robert E. Lee. And Freeman lived in Richmond, and I believe for many years had a radio program. Freeman was someone who was born at a time when he knew a lot of former soldiers. He knew many of these old Confederates as they were aging. He wrote a trilogy called Lee's Lieutenants. I think it's fair to say that these books today are dated, but they are still one of the best, if not the best, insight, not just into Robert E. Lee, but into the command structure of Lee's army, which we of course know as the Army of Northern Virginia. Freeman is, I think he's best described as very much an admirer of Robert E. Lee, but that doesn't tarnish his research, because it was groundbreaking. When these were published in the 1930s, there'd never been anything like this. And for me, I read these books, oh my gosh, a long, long time ago. There's also an abridged version. These were sort of consolidated into one book a number of years ago, but you can't go wrong. Douglas Southall Freeman, Lee's Lieutenants.
Maybe one of the most studied, but also one of the most understood men in the entire American Civil War. It's William Tecumseh Sherman. Robert O'Connell's Fierce Patriot takes on an entirely new look at William Tecumseh Sherman, looking at him not only just as a general, not only just as a soldier, but also as a human being. It's a psychological analysis, really, because he taps into the letters that Sherman writes home to his wife Ellen and really gets into the details and the emotions of this man in a really, really perfectly balanced way. And I mean, the subtitle here is The Tangled Lives of William Tecumseh Sherman. It talks about not only just his life as a soldier, but his pre-war life, his post-war life. And it taps into this idea of this man that is so reviled among many people today. It shows that he is a human being in, I think, really, really broad and perfectly aligned strokes. Sometimes Sherman is too easily simplified, and it's easy to put him in a box and say definitively one way or the other that he is something, but Fierce Patriot would lead to a greater understanding of who Sherman is, not only as a man, but as a soldier as well. If you've enjoyed this video, you can like and subscribe to the YouTube page. Make sure that we can continue to keep these videos going. Also, if you enjoyed any of the books, want to know more about these books, you can visit our website, boft.org/shop, or stop into any of our locations and pick up a couple of books for yourself. Thanks for watching.